First, we have to deconstruct our constant business expenses. Now, it should not include any one-time expenses that you charge for in a particular project of yours. In this table, you have to write a constant appearing expenses on monthly and yearly basis.
You will find 3 different colored columns for each scenario of your lifestyle: present, normal, and perfect. Present red column, as the title implies, shows your current expenses and earnings, which you have to follow and stay on course with. Normal yellow column shows expenses and earnings which you would feel comfortable living with. And perfect blue is the perfect scenario of more expensive way of business and life. So think of how would you like to grow as a freelancer and live your life in future, and write down expenses for each scenario. Expenses are also categorized as administrative, production, advertising and promotion, networking, and legal. Let me go through and give you some examples. You can write either in monthly or yearly expense section, or both, whichever is comfortable for you. Either way, it all will add up to a main final yearly expense. The first row is workspace expenses, and let's say that in the present scenario, in your current circumstances, you don't really rent anything, you just work from home. In such case, you just leave it as it is and keep it at 0. But let's say normally you would like to have a space to work from, for example like a co-working space for a freelancer, but you just cannot allow it yet. In such case, go to a normal column. This is a normal scenario for your lifestyle, and think about how much would it cost, and then write it down under the monthly section, and it will calculate your yearly expense here. But what about your perfect scenario, the most perfect workspace that you would like to have? Probably you would like to have your own personal office. Therefore, in the perfect column, this is the perfect lifestyle that you would like to have. Write down how much would it cost you. Probably the rent would be higher, right? It will also include utilities and internet and maintenance and so forth. So write those all down in the monthly section, and it will show you your yearly expense for the workspace. And in the final section, you will see the total workspace expense for the perfect scenario. You've got the point. So each scenario has got its own expense according to your desired lifestyle. Therefore, you have to think about where would you like to be in a perfect scenario, in the normal world, and in current circumstances as well. You'll see how it will add up in the future. We'll be able to find your hourly rates, and we'll be able to know how much you have to generate in revenue in order to cover these expenses and more. Some expenses are calculated as a long term, like within 5 or 3 years. You can also change this number manually if you believe that equipment needs changing within shorter or longer time. Just make a change. The good example would be a computer that you use for design or 3D modeling, which needs to be changed or upgraded each 3 or 5 years, if not each year. In the 5-year section, write down the full price of an item, and it will divide it by 5, or whichever number that you have specified. For example, under the supplies and furniture, you might need to buy a new table or a chair each 3-5 years. And if you override the formula, don't worry, simply write it again. Just write equals, then select the amount in a 5-year section and divide it by the year that you have specified. Now let me quickly go through each row of the expense and mention some expenses that you might write down. Under the supplies and furniture, you can write down an office supplies. For example, pencils, pens, paper, anything that you use for your daily administrative work. And maybe, as I mentioned before, you would like to renew your chair or table each 5 or 3 years. So write those down. The next one is phone and communications. For example, if you use a separate phone for your work only, that's the place you need to write it down. And normally in this day and age, technology is so fast that we change phone each year. And the phone plan, just write it down here. Under the hardware row, you can write down the computer that you use for your administrative work. For example, sending emails, going online, typing and so forth. Also, maybe you use a printer to print papers and use them for your work and so on. So write down all hardware that you will use for your administrative purposes. And then software, which is also only for administrative work. So it might be that you need more space for your files, so maybe you need a Google Drive, maybe you use a Microsoft Office, maybe some additional project management tools or invoice and account software. Write all those down here. And then the postage and shipping. It might be that you need to order or ship something for yourself, or maybe you need to post something to your client. And any other administrative expenses, if you think of something additional, just write those here. And here we end with administrative expenses, which are green. And we move on towards the production section, which is yellow. Now there are so many professions. It might be that you use some material for your work. Maybe you use some equipment that requires services and repairs as well. It might be packaging. Maybe you use a vehicle and you need to replace your vehicle probably each 5 years. Also, if you use a vehicle, there's additional row for vehicle expenses such as car insurance, fuel, parking, repairs, maintenance, and maybe a technical insurance. The next one is hardware, but only that you use for production. For example, if you do a 3D modeling or rendering, you'll need a really strong computer here, so you'll also need to replace it each 5 years, or maybe in a shorter time. And again, technology is advancing so fast that you probably will need additional RAMs in a year time and maybe a graphic card. And then softwares for your production. If you editing videos, you can use Adobe products. Maybe you use Photoshop, or maybe you need more space, so you need Google Drive. And maybe in the perfect scenario, you need a lot more softwares like Maya or Cinema 4D and other production expenses. The next section is advertising and promotion. The first one is web hosting. It might be that you will decide to have a website and you'll use web development platforms like Wix in order to create your website, and then you need domain, and all that needs to be covered. Under the next row, marketing. If you use SEO or email marketing or anything to do with marketing, write those down here. For advertising, it can be a contextual advertising on Google, maybe YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. And sales, if you use any additional tools like CRM or else. And for example, in other marketing sales expenses, you can write business cards and so forth. The next one is networking, which is purple. During your career, you probably will grow. You will learn new things and you will develop your skill. That's what you write down in professional development row, the expenses for the tutorials, for seminars, or maybe events. The next one is travel and entertainment, but this is only in the brackets of networking. So if you meet your client in the restaurant and you pay for the meals, then you write down how much it costs and how much roughly you will spend monthly and so forth. Then other networking expenses that you might think of. The next section is legal, which is blue. In the first row, legal and accounting, it might be in the future you will have your own accountant, and maybe you will need a lawyer for a specific contract to form. And equipment and business insurance. For example, if you use a film camera or photo camera, you might want equipment insurance. And any other business insurances that you might think of, write it down here. And the final one is other legal expenses, so anything that you might think of. So that will be shortly, and if you think of something extra, just add additional row or just write anything anywhere here. Once you fill it in completely, at the bottom you will find your total annual and monthly business expenses for each scenario, and normally it should be higher with each scenario.